This production has been brought to you by the Free Lunch Podcast. Unauthorized use and or duplication of this material without express and written permission from the Free Lunch Podcast is strictly prohibited.
This show has been brought to you by the Thomas Allen Collection. The Thomas Allen Collection is a men's accessory line designed to attract and capture a variety of tastes with a unique appeal. Thomas Allen strives to produce an extraordinary design to turn a new leaf on fashion for men and at desired occasions. If I told you once, I told you several times on this podcast that when ladies, get your men a Thomas Allen Collection tie. They'll love it. Gentlemen, get you a Thomas Allen Collection tie. You can't go wrong with rocking a Thomas Allen Collection tie at a formal event. I'll be rocking one in an upcoming at the CBC events. BG, don't you own a Thomas Allen Collection tie?
Yes, sir. And they way fly than anything that's already out there. I got a couple of them, so I recommend going out there and getting some of that flavor.
Yep, Thomas Allen Collection. You can reach him at 678-960-9171. 678-960-9171. Thomas Allen, when tying a knot really counts. Now on to the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, a classic.
This love. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Yeah, I chose the path chose me. It's a Lord's plan, divine decree. Natural high, window sheet, up a parallel view, let the ghetto see. BK, NOLA, OMF, GLD, Amazing Grace, Hater Whispers.
Welcome to the Free Lunch Podcast, home of the New South Movement. This is your boy Tight, one half of the Free Lunch Podcast duo. I got the main man, B Jeezy, with me. B Jeezy, what's happening?
Yep, BG the 27 kid. I'm doing this Free Lunch Podcast thing, interviewing as usual, Southern journalistic. How you feel today, Tight?
Hey, no games, no gimmicks. We never not working, guys, so it's been a very interesting time. Looking forward to today's guest. We had the honor of really having a conversation, I think, that's going to be new to a lot of our audience members, but one that's very historic in nature. And I'm really interested in this particular guest because of just his experience and being able to share with us the time frame of what was going on back in the early 60s and 70s and his relationships that he's built throughout the years. So I think it's going to be a really, really, really entertaining but very informative and interesting show.
Might be one of the most controversial guests that we've had in a while. And not controversial because of his history, but controversial as him and instructing me on how to be a better man.
All right.
Let's get into that. But yeah, indeed, like you said, an historical figure, someone that has a story, and a story that we can relate to as it stands, with being in a mode of wanting to see a better world and a better place, coming from a humanitarian standpoint, and wanting to exist in a space to where all people are treated fairly and equally, and is treated as human beings, regardless of race, creed, gender, and all those type of things. So his story does reflect that. He's been a fighter and an advocate for those type of rights, for people's rights. What our listeners should get from it today, man, is should get some history.
Definitely.
And definitely some perspective, which is what we aim to do here.
And even before you introduce him, but one thing I wanted to also say was we like to use this show as a time capsule. For our audience members, we like to be able to capture from the horse's mouth, per se, in our case, from our guest's mouth, history. And it can't be rewritten, it can't be retold, because it's coming from the source and from the primary source. And being able to use this podcast as a platform to empower our listeners, both from a educational perspective, but also empower them just from an inspirational perspective as well. So I just wanted to make certain that I kind of make that point, how we use this as a time capsule.
All right, so getting into it, our special guest today is Mr. Bill Ayers. He's an American elementary education theorist. and a former leader in the counterculture movement that opposed U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. He's known for his activism during the 60s and also known for his current work in education reform, curriculum, and instruction, which will be a very important part of this discussion as it relates to current educational system. In 1969, I think that date is correct, co-founded the Weather Underground. And he'll get into explaining fully what the Weather Underground is. As of right now, he's a retired professor, retired from the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, formerly holding titles of Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior University Scholar. And to some, you may have heard his name come up here recently, 2008, leading into the presidential campaign and the presidential election of now President Barack Obama. So we'll have some of that in this podcast too. But to our Free Lunch Podcast family, we would like to take this time to welcome our special guest, Mr. Bill Ayers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, can I tell an interesting story? Let me tell you how nice this guy is for us. I literally met him at an event in D.C. Celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Busboys and Poets, and had an opportunity just to talk with him for, if you're willing and you're open to it, I would love to have you on our show. And from a series of emails, he was more than willing and interested in joining our show. So just from the emails that we've shared and we've done back and forth, I really just want to personally thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with the people today what you were standing for back in that time and just provide some historical perspective to what was going on. So thank you a lot.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And I was the third party in those email exchanges, but it seemed like it was almost the next day or 2 days after the event that Mr. Ayers got back with us and was, I could just feel the excitement and him being willing to come and have this discussion with us today. So like you say, extremely grateful. But I got to ask a question.
Sure.
The young man came in with a T-shirt, and I'm a T-shirt guy. That T-shirt reads, Black Lives Matter.
That's right.
Black Lives Matter. And you recently wrote a piece, a short blog on Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is controversial, especially controversial for those that are not black.
Well, I have this shirt on. I was wearing it today. It's fascinating. Like everything else in America, it's kind of a signal, and I get various reactions. Mm-hmm. Some people scowl at me, and some people lean over and say, "I like your shirt." And it's just, I think it's odd for people to see me because I'm 70 years old. The world reads me as an old white guy, but I am very much committed to this movement. I'm very much supportive of it, and in Chicago, very active as a supporter of it. So it's exciting.
What does that movement mean to you?
As a longtime radical revolutionary, I've always felt that what makes social change is social movements. Social change is not made because we get the right leader who has a better heart than the last leader. If you just take a quick look at history, Lyndon Johnson was not part of the Black Freedom Movement. He was a cracker from Texas, and yet he passed the most far-reaching legislation regarding civil rights since Reconstruction. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, wasn't part of the labor movement. He was a patrician, elite, rich person from the Hudson Valley. And Abraham Lincoln never belonged to an abolitionist party. Those three presidents are remembered for something. What are they remembered for? They're remembered for doing the right thing when a social movement exploded from below and pushed them to do the right thing. You can see some of this in the movie Selma if you want to go back to Lyndon Johnson. I know the Lyndon Johnson fan club is all disappointed. Right. And as I pointed out at the time, yeah, they should be. It's not historically accurate. In the movie, he only uses the N-word twice. In real life, he used it 17 times before breakfast. Right. The idea that somehow he got a bad shake. The reality is there was fire from below. Lyndon Johnson responded to it. He was the most effective politician of his generation, and things happened. But King wasn't begging the great man for a meeting. Lyndon Johnson wanted to meet with King. There was a revolution in the streets, and the man in charge had to do something about it. So that's why, to get back to where you began, to me, what I'm seeing on the street right now is young people bringing to our consciousness, the whole nation's consciousness, something that you and I know has been permanent for decades and centuries. The murder, the serial assassination of young black people is an American tradition. So that's not what's new. And yes, the media getting it on camera, that's somewhat new. But I reread a column that my friend Salim Muakil, who writes for In These Times in Chicago, he used to be an editor at Muhammad Speaks. Salim wrote a column in 1980 that begins with the name of a guy killed by the police. The police said, it turns out it wasn't true. Then another guy killed by the police. The police said, the official story was, turns out it wasn't true. That's been going, and that was written 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it's not new. What's new is the fight back. And that gives me enormous confidence, happiness. I look at these young people today. I'll bring you guys into it. You've aged out of the youth movement in a way, but I hate to say it. But look, go back to your high school, BG, and you will find that you are not hip. I'm sorry.
I know about it.
You wish you were, but you're not. Because the culture keeps changing. But I'm saying, I'm looking at these young people today in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, in the Bay Area, in Atlanta, in DC, and I'm looking at these young people, and they remind me of nothing so much as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kids of 50 years ago. Oh, I should also say, now that I say that, 50 years ago yesterday was the first time I was arrested, opposing the war in Vietnam, sitting in at a draft board, hauled off to jail. So that's 50 years ago yesterday. And from that day until this, I've considered myself, an activist, a revolutionary, somebody who wants to see a real transformation around two dimensions, really, or three. But let's say where I started. Where I started was I wanted to end the war in Vietnam. And then as it deepened, I wanted to end the cause of war, or the reason that this country is always in a permanent state of war. And the second thing I wanted to throw my lot in with the Black Freedom Movement, which was shaking the country and setting the moral agenda. And so, yes, I fought in the Civil Rights Movement, but I very much fought in favor of defeating white supremacy. It wasn't just a matter of, can we get into the club? Right. It was a matter of exchanging the structures. That just brings to mind an argument I was having the other day with some of my students, because in our vocabulary in the United States, we use the word racism to mean two distinct things. Mm-hmm. One thing we mean is bigotry and ignorance. Mm-hmm. And another thing some of us mean is the structures of white supremacy, the structures of racial hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. And that both go back to the beginning. But a lot of people, especially, liberally minded people, think that the wellspring of the structural inequality is the stupid bigotry. But that's not true. The stupid bigotry comes to justify the structural inequality. See what I'm saying?
Like class, more of a class type.
Well, it's not just, it is race. In this country, one of the conundrums that folks have always had is, how do you understand the alchemy of race and class? And it's not easy to sort out. Brilliant people like Grace Lee Boggs, who left us this week at the age of 100, Grace Lee Boggs or Angela Davis, have tried to sort this out and have done a good job, but it's a complicated thing. But my larger point is that my students, for example, can give themselves a pass, some of them, and say, well, I'm not a racist. When what they mean by that is, I'm not Clive Bundy, that knucklehead, in seizing land in Utah or wherever he was. I'm not Donald Sterling, the basketball owner. I'm not Donald Trump. I don't say ignorant, bigoted things. I've never used the N-word in my life. That's what they would say to themselves. But that doesn't mean you're free of being implicated in the structural inequality. So Donald Sterling's a perfect example. What got him in trouble was talking to his lover on the phone and calling black people some nasty names. But what didn't get him into trouble was that he made a fortune being a slumlord in Southern California. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is interesting. I think we got to break that apart a little bit and say, you don't get off the hook just because you're not an ignorant bigot. Right. You got to see the reality of, and what I always tell white folks is, if you can see and understand and throw your lot against white supremacy, there's a place for you in the movement. There's a good place for you. If you can't see it, then you've got to dig a little deeper.
You don't have to do this, Bill. So what's the driving force?
Well, I think sometimes we think the only motivation to get involved in struggle is when you yourself have been pinned to the wall. And that's not actually true. A lot of people are involved in the struggle, and they have to do it because their humanity is at stake.
Right.
You know, I was having a talk with some friends the other day about this question of white allies, which I sometimes object to that language. You know, the white allies of the black movement.
I understand.
You know, because on the one hand, if in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, I want to be a good ally in the sense that I want to listen, but then I know everything either because I'm older, because I have some cultural power or racial privilege. No, I don't want to do that. I want to listen. So if you're a good ally, you want to listen. But there's a deeper level, and it gets back to BG's point. The deeper level is, I don't want to think of myself as an ally. I want to think of it as my struggle in this sense. And it's complicated, but in this sense, in the sense that I'm not free if you're not free. You know, we could make it an analogy with men and women. You know, the reason feminism can be a very important movement for men is because when women are equal and win their equality, we can get off of our ridiculously well-defended high horse and be happier and better and more human. Their struggle's our struggle. So you're an ally, but at the same time, you want to embrace it and say it's my struggle. You know, who made this point brilliantly, the first time I ever read it was James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, in some of his essays, would argue that when black freedom is achieved, white people will be free not to be white people. Wow. What a profound idea.
That is very
you know, because it takes a lot of energy to hold on to your, you know, to kind of always be barricaded and walk down the street frightened and miserable. You know, Baldwin also said whiteness is a vulnerable idea. Vulnerable in the sense that we know it's a social construction. We know it's nonsense. We also know that it's the harshest American reality. So it's both. It's a fiction. It's a fact. And so you say you didn't have to, and I want to say my humanity demanded that I do it. I had to. My existential, and frankly, this is true of many, many, many struggles. You don't enter into a struggle often saying, I'm going to win. I'll give you a contemporary example. We defeated the death penalty in Illinois. We defeated the death penalty. We abolished the death penalty in Illinois. It was a many, many decades struggle. When they executed the first man in Illinois, when they reinstated the death penalty, and the first man they executed was a guy named John Wayne Gacy. You might have heard of him. He's kind of famous, but maybe not. It's a long time ago. He was a serial murderer of young men. He would pick up young men in gay part of town and murder them and dismember them and so on. So when they finally got around to where they were going to execute him, my wife and I drew straws, and I won. And I went down to Statesville. She stayed home and put the kids to bed. And I went down to Statesville to protest. Now, I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know if I would find people or not find people. But I was determined that the ghoulishness of what I was hearing on the radio, the joy with which AM rock radio was cheerleading the murderer, the state murder of this guy. He's not a nice guy, but I couldn't stand to see the state murder him without me being there saying, I object. So I drive down there middle of the night, and I get there, and there's a rock party going on. There must be 2,000 kids in pickup trucks with boom boxes and beer, and they're all there to see the monster die. You know, when the lights go down, they're going to be a big party. And I felt miserable. I felt, what a sad day for humanity. I took my little sign I'd made, which said, thou shalt not kill. I hid it because I didn't want to get beat up on my way to the front of the prison. I go to the front of the prison, and I find there 8 elderly nuns, myself, and 2 lawyers. And we got candles, and we're singing, you know, spirituals, and you know, we're trying to be a force against this murder. They killed him. You know, we were a marginal group, and if I've ever felt marginalized in my life, and I have, I felt supremely marginalized that night. Got back to my car, disgusted, drove home, and on the way home, I had this thought, we're never going to stop the death penalty in Illinois. It's too popular and it's too, kind of primal. But at least I was there to say, I'm not part of that. I am not part of that. 2 years later, the lawyer standing next to me won the first wrongful conviction suit. 8 years later, the governor of Illinois was persuaded to become an abolitionist. And the day before he got he left office, the governor, and it's parenthetically, when you leave the governor's office in Illinois, you go straight to jail. So, I mean, that's the route, that's the career path. In any case, George Ryan, yeah, it's a career path. George Ryan, the day before he left office, we had been organizing, getting pressure put on him in a lot of different directions. He was out at breakfast at a diner in Chicago, and he got a phone call on his cell phone. It was Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela said, you have the power in your hands to do the right thing. Oh, and this right-wing, corrupt, conservative governor cleared death row.
Wow.
I mean, you just never know. Mm-hmm. But the point I'm making is that the calculus of me going down there wasn't the calculus of I'm going to win. It wasn't the calculus of my brother's on death row. It wasn't the calculus of I'm personally impacted by this. I'm impacted as a human being. And my struggle to end the death penalty puts me in solidarity with all humanity. So I'm just saying, I don't always think that we join movements because it's going to personally, in a small, narrow, immediate sense, improve our lives. In fact, it creates a life of struggle, but in many ways, you get a lot of joy from it.
And that's like a conversation I was having, with my parents, who kind of come from that same mode of humanity and standing up for what's right. And I think that's the place where you live at, is just, being on the side of being righteous and standing up and being for those things that are good for us globally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in a way, I mean, I'm going to take your parents' side again and again. But to me, that notion that you grow your soul by the choices you make. I mean, what makes an identity? Inside your own head, you're a good person. We're all good people inside our own heads.
Right.
But how do you forge an identity? Because you're also living in a world. So sometimes you have to stand up. So you started with my little T-shirt. In a funny way, getting on the airplane this morning, I got a lot of reactions. but I knew who I was. I knew who I was. So I had this one African-American stewardess. She couldn't have been nicer. And she leaned over and said, love your shirt. Now, she wasn't going to say it out loud in front of everybody, but she was going to say it to me. Somebody else was scowling at me. That's okay with me.
On the plane today?
Huh?
You say on the plane they were scowling?
Yeah, on the plane. I've had a lot of experiences on planes where people either recognize me or, one thing or another. But today it was simply this shirt. Some people approve, some don't approve. But the larger point I'm making is the way you form an identity is by the steps you take. It's not by being a nice person in your head. We're all nice in our head. You can't sit on your couch in a dorm and smoke a joint and consider yourself a moral person. I'm not against you sitting in your couch and smoking a joint, but that's not where your humanity is most alive. That's not where your morality is tested, right?
Mm-hmm. Let's go back 50 years ago, because BG had an interesting point, and you kind of touched on it. But SDS, I read that it was at one of those meetings where you became more radical, I guess, per se. But can you kind of take us back 50 years ago?
Sure. I was a college student at the University of Michigan in 1963. Mm-hmm. The civil rights movement was at a certain point of, the narrative that young people hear about the civil rights movement makes it sound like a very neat narrative. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. But it wasn't like that,
right.
So the fiction we tell each other, we tell young people, is that, I'll tell you a funny story about this in a second, but, the fiction we say is there was once a bad time in America when there was kind of an apartheid system, segregation, and there were some racists in the South. And then a savior came along and he had a dream and led a boycott and gave a speech, won a Nobel Prize, and now we're so much better. Yeah, right. Now that narrative is patently false, right? I mean, that narrative is demonstrably wrong. The reality is the Black freedom movement has existed since slaves arrived on these shores, and it's still going on. And yes, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s and 50s was an important moment in that. But so was GIs coming home from World War II. That was an important moment in it. So was the struggle for recharged genocide against lynching, which Paul Robeson and others led. So it goes on. And if you want to see something great these days, go see Stanley Nelson's new film, The Black Panther Party.
Definitely.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to see that in Birmingham.
Isn't it a great film?
Great, man.
I mean, it's a great film, and Stanley's a brilliant, talented filmmaker. But okay, so I was in college, and as I said earlier, the African American freedom movement, the Black freedom movement, was defining the moral consciousness of the country. Now, most people weren't involved in it, but still, it was defining what it meant to be a human being, and people had to choose sides, right? And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which were contemporaries of mine, were organizers in the South who had projects all over the South. Registering people to vote was part of it, but that was just one of the many tactics that they used. And in the North, there were students who were gathering to both be supportive and to be a part of this social upheaval that was happening. 1961, Students for a Democratic Society was founded as a student movement, as a student group. SNCC was not a membership organization; it was field secretaries. SDS was a membership organization. So I joined SDS. I was a community organizer in Cleveland with SDS in a joint project with SNCC. But in the mid-late 60s, I got elected to be a national officer of SDS. Now you asked, did something in particular radicalize me? I was a kid from the suburbs. I was a kid of enormous privilege. I didn't know much. I grew up in kind of the spongy, soft 50s of privilege for folks like me. I didn't know much. I go to Michigan and my eyes begin to open. And it's painful. And I'm looking and I'm seeing a world on fire. I'm seeing the hypocrisy of all the things I was raised with, land of the free, home of the brave. And I'm seeing that played out all over the South and increasingly in the North. And then I'm seeing war here and war there. And that begins to change my idea of what's going on. So I think everything's beautiful, but as I open my eyes, I see a world in...
Are you traveling to the South during this time and seeing what's happened, or is most of this what you're seeing on TV coverage?
Well, I was traveling around the North, and I came south a couple of times for conferences. But basically, I was seeing what was going on in the North. So, for example, I was arrested. I was first arrested in 1965. As I say, 50 years ago yesterday. And I didn't know much. But I did know enough to say there's something deeply wrong with a big, mighty, powerful nation like this going 10,000 miles away, to drop bombs on a country the size of Florida. So I didn't know much, but I thought it was wrong. So I sat in and I got arrested. We copied the tactic and the idea from the civil rights movement, right? And so I got arrested. I ended up doing 10 days in jail. At that point, 1965, 80% of Americans supported the war. 80%. About 15% opposed the war. And my big campus, the University of Michigan, considered in hindsight to be a hotbed of radicalism. In my campus, I would say 75% of students supported the war. So we were a tiny minority. We had a rally on campus. There were 300 of us. We marched over the draft board. 39 of us were arrested. We were surrounded by 2,000 students who wanted to see us not only arrested, but expelled. So it wasn't popular. That's the point I'm making. It wasn't that it was popular, but it was right. And so I was arrested. 3 years, fast forward 3 years, 1968, a majority of the country is against the war. What happened? I would point to three things, although many things happened. One is that folks like me started opening our eyes. It was painful because living, in your little glorious privileged blindness can be a nice comfortable thing, not a nice thing, but a comfortable thing. So there was folks like me organizing, and I did organize. But more important than that, the Black freedom movement in large part came out against the war. Black people generally, but the Black freedom movement. To have Muhammad Ali say, I'm not going 10,000 miles away to, no Viet Cong, he said, ever called me the N-word. I'm not fighting in the white man's army. And now the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee issued a statement saying we should not go 10,000 miles away to fight for a so-called freedom we don't enjoy in Mississippi. The country shook. And then to have Martin Luther King for 2 years say this war is immoral, it's illegal. And again, his most famous speech on this was 1 year to the day before he was assassinated, April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, in which he said, and by the way, if you want to get a real history lesson, you think Jeremiah Wright gave some sermons? Go read Martin Luther King's sermons. America's going to hell. He was not playing. He was pretty harsh. And so you listen to King on April 4th, 1967, and he says, my country is in the wrong side of the world revolution. He talks again about the three evils of racism, materialism, and militarism. He says that people who criticize him for being involved in the Vietnam War issue don't either understand him or his message. He says, the war is my issue. Are you kidding? And so to have King say the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country, shook the country. And then the third element was veterans coming home and telling the truth. And it takes 3 years for Americans, it turns out, to get the truth. But vets came home, famously throwing their medals at Congress, the bastards who'd sent them, to fight and die and kill. My brother was a deserter. My younger brother, deserted and joined me and was with me underground for 11 years. But the most famous of those guys coming home was the current Secretary of State, who's now himself implicated in all kinds of horrible crimes against humanity. But at that point, as a 23, 24-year-old coming home from Vietnam, he testified before the Senate and famously said, we commit war crimes in Vietnam every day, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of policy. That was huge. That was profound. The country shook. The people turned against the war. We had done everything we could think of. We'd mobilized and marched. We'd been arrested multiple times. Civil disobedience. I'd spent summers going door to door in Detroit, knocking on doors, persuading people that the war was illegal and immoral. And the war ground on. So in the spring of 1968, when the Tet Offensive happens, which was a national uprising in Vietnam, and basically the U.S. was defeated, and everybody recognized that. Lyndon Johnson announced he was going to leave the presidency and work for peace in Vietnam. We thought we had won. So we streamed out of our apartments in Ann Arbor and Palo Alto and Cambridge and Atlanta and Boston. And in Ann Arbor, where I was, we swirled around the campus and we landed on the steps of the president of the University of Michigan. Thousands of us. And he came out, he had a bullhorn, and I had a bullhorn. I was the president of SDS, and he was the president of the university. And I had my little pathetic bullhorn. I think all I did was curse into my bullhorn, because that's
all you did.
About as articulate as I could get back then. Anyway, what he said into his bullhorn was, congratulations. He's speaking to the anti-war students. And he says to us, congratulations, you've won a great victory. Now the war will end. And that night, the end of March 1968, he believed it and I believed it. We went home happy. And 4 days later, King was murdered. And 2 months later, Kennedy was murdered. And 2 months after that, Henry Kissinger emerges from whatever swamp he was dwelling in. I think it was Harvard. And he's got a plan, quote, to end the war. But it's actually a plan to expand the war without American casualties. And that begins the air war and the naval assault on Vietnam. So what do we do? This is the question. What do we do? We've spent all this time fighting against the war. We've won. We've convinced the people. We've done what we set out to do. And the war goes on. And here's the kicker. Every week that the war goes on, 6,000 innocent people are murdered. Every week. not every month, and there's no end in sight. So what do you do? And I'm the middle of 5 children in my birth family. What do you do? One of my brothers joined the Democratic Party and tried to build a peace movement. One of my brothers deserted the army and was part of the Great Migration to Canada. One went to the communes to get the hell out of, and one went to the factories to try to organize the working class. And I did what I did, which is I was part of an organization called the Weather Underground that was determined to take the war to the war makers. We considered ourselves, well, we were indeed fugitives from the law. We broke the law. Many would say we broke boundaries of common sense. Many would say we were foolish. We were young, and young people tend to be, silly around certain things. But I'm not, and I don't even defend everything we did. But I know that we were part of that large spectrum of trying to figure out what to do in the face of genocide. And none of the 5 of us did the right thing. And none of the 5 of us was crazy.
I am curious to just understand at this point, what are your parents thinking? And the reason I asked that question, because you mentioned it earlier. You come from a pretty proficient background. Your dad, very privileged background. Your dad, is it true his name's on one of the buildings at Northwestern?
Yeah, they named a building after him.
They named a building after you.
Yeah, I went up to the dedication. That was many years after this, all that we're talking about. He was the chairman of the electric monopoly, Commonwealth Edison, and he was Commonwealth Edison in Chicago, and for 30 years. And he was a very powerful businessman in Chicago. And just to jump around a little, but the last 5 years of his life, he lived with me and my wife. He had Alzheimer's, and we took care of him. So, you can reconcile with your family, with your people. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing about my dad is, towards the end of his life, even before he got dementia, he was a big defender of mine. But it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is it's easy to see what you would have done in retrospect. I mean, everybody would have been marching at the front line with King, or during the days of slavery. Everybody would have been running away or joining John Brown. It doesn't quite work like that, but in retrospect, everybody's on the right side, once the issue is resolved. So my dad and I reconciled in that regard. Mm-hmm. And he knew and always knew that I was a radical and that I was a socialist, and that, I don't think that we ever saw eye to eye politically. But in those years, especially when I was the head of one of the leaders of SDS, which was based in Chicago, he both found, I would say he found my political involvement, unbelievable. I mean, because he had no framework to understand why you would involve yourself in this stuff. He thought of himself as a good person. As a businessman, he was involved in affirmative action. In fact, when King came to Chicago, my father was one of the 2 negotiators between King and the Daley administration, because he was a prominent businessman who had liberal tendencies. Mm-hmm. But I'd see him on the news negotiating these meetings with the real estate board. Meanwhile, I'd be out in the streets in Cicero in the marches. So we're the same family, different thinking and different ideas and different life experience. But at that time, I think my parents were frantic for me not to go down the tubes. And yet we did. We went underground, and when we surfaced 11 years later, in a funny way, both my wife's parents were lower middle class Jewish, immigrants, and they their first comment to us was, "Are you married?" Which we thought was kind of bizarre. Like, that's what you're worried about? And my dad's first comment was that he thought I needed a haircut. Well, this is, I wanted to say, Dad, I've been fighting the state for 11 years, and I've been charged with all these crimes, and you're worried about my haircut. Parents are parents, they can't stop themselves sometimes. But no, I think he was very worried about me in those years. But he never, frankly, I got to give it to him. He never betrayed me in a profound fundamental sense. He never said he thought we were off the deep end, but he didn't think that we were completely crazy either.
And the 60s definitely you kind of go down as this moment that like the country just hit this boiling point on all levels of the Black freedom movement, anti-war, and all of these things.
And feminist movement, and cultural upheaval, and music was changing, and art was changing. It was a very exciting time in many ways. The only thing I would add to that, though, BG, is that I think we make a fetish out of thinking in terms of decades. Nobody lives by decades. You know what I mean? Like I don't remember December 31st, 1969. Look at my watch and say, "Oh shit, it's almost over. We got to do something." I mean, the 50s bleed into the 60s. In fact, one of the things we know. I mean, you have an interest in the kind of history of slavery. One of the things we know about slavery is the afterlife of slavery is still with us.
Oh,
it's not like abolition. Now we're in a different world. It was different, and it was importantly different, but it wasn't so different that you didn't recognize. And so we're still with the afterlife of slavery. And the 60s, was Rosa Parks part of the 60s? That was the 50s. Yes, she was part of the 60s. And was the gay movement part of the 60s? Well, it was the 70s. But still, yes. You know. So I'm just saying we don't want to fetishize what's basically, I sometimes think the 60s is commodified and sold back to us as myth and symbol. And I don't feel it that way. I feel like when people think of me as a person from the 60s, I say, yeah, but I'm also of the right now. And whatever the 60s was in your mind right now. And I want to be there. So when you guys construct the barrel, bring my walker right over to the barricades and hurl it on them.
So in that right now, do you remember like being afraid?
Yeah,
fearful, concerned because you were standing out there, and a lot of what you were standing for was at the time.
Stanley Nelson movie about the Black Panthers. Remember the siege of the Los Angeles Panther office? Okay, I was very close when Fred Hampton was murdered. I mean, our office was right down the street from his office, and Fred's assassination was a very serious, life-turning moment for us. 4 days later, the LA Panthers the siege of the LA Panther office goes on. And when I saw it again on the film, it all came back to me vividly and viscerally. It was hard. But one of the things I'm going to draw your attention to your memory to, you haven't seen it yet.
I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, they interviewed two survivors, both of whom have now passed away. Stanley's interviewing them about the siege, and they're describing the siege, and you're seeing visuals of it, and they're barricaded in the office. And so the most astonishing thing, you talk about existential reality, a moment for a human being, is this guy Farr describes being in this room. They try to come in, and bam, bam, bam. He drives them out. And then he says, I did. And for those 3 hours, I was a free Negro. I mean, I was faint to sense that, when you feel free, it's a paradox. We walk down the street, we don't exactly feel free. We're just walking down the street, right? You smoke a joint, you don't feel free. You're just smoking a joint. But when you feel like you're on a barricade, metaphorically or really, free to choose who to be. And Farr chose to be in that room. And of course, for those 3 hours, I was a free Negro.
Right.
Damn. And Stanley said, during the making of that complicated movie, complicated story to tell, he said, whenever I'd get a little lost, a little confused and not certain where to go, I'd put that up on the editing machine. I'd watch him say that. And it inspired me. To go on and keep making the film. Man. Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
I mean,
and seeing it and really putting into perspective what was going on in that moment.
So we were underground, on the run from the FBI. We would go into a rural post office. We would see our pictures up there, on our wanted posters. And this went on, and my wife was on the 10 Most Wanted list with Angela Davis and Rap Brown, and and it was intense. They were after us, and it's always said armed and dangerous. So we were being set up. We were being set up. If you see us, shoot us
because they're armed
and so did it feel scary? You bet. But did it feel free? It felt free. It felt like and I don't know if you go back and listen to some of Bernadine's communiques. I mean, I think she is embarrassed to some extent and thinks that the rhetoric got ahead of us. But the rhetoric does get ahead of you. You know, the Panther rhetoric was ahead of them and so on. But the first communique from the Weather Underground ends with her saying something like, "Don't look for us, pig, because we see you," or something like that. You know, and the rhetoric is way inflated, but it reflects that sense that we were free. You can't find us, you know. And so, yes, we were scared. One of the things that that allowed us to survive for 11 years, two things to mention. One is that nobody wanted us arrested. I was recognized every week on the street by somebody. Why would you want me arrested if you were part of the youth? You know, I'm going down the street in Northern California, and somebody, you know, sees me, and they know who I am, but they're not going to turn me in because they have no interest in me being turned in. We're on the same side, so we're like fish in the sea. We're not, and I would be driving through San Francisco, and I'd see a big picture of my wife's wanted poster in somebody's window, and it would say, "Bernadine Dorn, welcome here." Or another one, "Angela Davis, welcome here." Right? Asada Shakur now, welcome here. And so you're like a fish in the sea. That's one reason we survived. And the second, I think, is that we made a choice to stop gut checking each other and to trust each other. What I mean by that is, instead of saying, "Are you brave enough to do this?" we would say, "How you feeling?" And if you said, "I'm scared," we'd say, "I'm scared too." You know, and that meant that that we were more real with each other. So we were real with each other, and the community had our back, and we survived for 11 years.
Well, so let's go back. Can you explain the creation of Weather Underground and how you guys broke off from SDS? You were one of the founders of Weather Underground. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, the way that the breakup happened is, I told you that, you know, we had reached a point, again, the serial assassination of black leaders, King, Hampton, Malcolm X, then the Panthers in New York and the Panthers in LA. And it was coming to be a regular kind of thing, right? And supporting them and helping them not to be assassinated was a complicated set of challenges. And the war was dragging on, and 6,000 people a week were being murdered. So what do you do? And within SDS, the political arguments became very intense. And frankly, the black movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement, all experienced splits. I could tell you the minutiae of our split, but I think the larger point is that people didn't know the right way forward. And we had won certain concessions, the Voting Rights Act, for example, certain decisions. And people didn't, and we'd won the country over to believing the war was wrong, and they were supposedly negotiating to end the war, but it kept 6,000 people a week kept being killed. So nobody knew the way forward, and that creates tensions within a movement. And of course, the FBI was moving, as you saw in the Panther film, very aggressively to sow discontent, you know, so that they would have the Eldridge Cleaver people being propagandized against the Huey Newton people and vice versa. That was moving. They were manipulating. They were, doing terrible, terrible things like that. But all that said, I think the deepest reason that these splits happened was that no one knew the way forward. We decided, a small group of us who happened to be in the leadership or part of the leadership of SDS, decided that we had to find a way to effectively resist the murderous assault on Vietnam and on the black movement. And we had to find a way to survive what we saw as an impending American fascism. That's how we saw it. We saw fascism growing, the assassination of Fred being the clearest thing. You know, we knew something, and you will find this familiar. Fred Hampton is assassinated, right? And the news reports for the next week are that the Panthers, they were just being served a summons. And the Panthers started shooting. And it takes 3 or 4 years for a legal decision to come and for an investigation to happen independently that awards Mrs. Hampton, $1.5 million, because they clearly went in and said they drugged him Then they went and assassinated him. So they claimed it was a shootout. It wasn't a shootout. It was an assassination. Well, the same kind of stuff was happening over and over. So we said, we have to survive this coming, repression. We have to survive it. And we can't fight if either we're all dead or if we spend all of our time in defense committees with lawyers, raising money to defend ourselves.
Right.
We saw that as a pattern that was part of the repression. It wasn't like the legal repression was kind of somehow the nice side. It was better, I suppose, than killing people, but it killed you anyway because they tied you up for years and years and all your resources. And we said, we're not going to do that. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to create an underground organization. And we began to create it. And we began to develop networks of safe houses and false identification papers. And we began to learn the craft of being underground. And just as we were beginning to learn it, there was an accidental explosion in New York City. My girlfriend at the time was killed. My best friend was killed. Ted Gold, Diana Outten, Terry Robbins were killed. And then we all went underground spontaneously. We didn't plan to do it that way. Our plan was to do it much more subtly, but we couldn't do it subtly because it happened and so we were all indicted. We were indicted on conspiracy to cross state lines, the Rap Brown indictment, conspiracy to cross state lines to destroy government property, and conspiracy to cross state lines to cause civil disturbance. And we were all indicted. And we said, well, we're not going to show up. And at that point, we were dubbed the Weather Underground.
To our listeners, there is a book that you can actually go out and purchase, Fugitive Days, that Mr. Ayers he wrote, and he talks about a lot of this in that book. The story you just told about the accidental bombing and those type of stories that occurred are covered in that book. So I do recommend that you go out and really do some research and really read that story because it's very fascinating, and we're getting the one-on-one level right now, but it actually goes into more detail for some of the different other bombings that occurred. At a high level, then we can move on to the 2008 controversy.
Yeah, let's do that. Although I'll just say,
we are interested, but just can you just briefly, if you don't mind, just talk about some of the bombings that the Weather Underground was.
We were. This is another fascinating thing to think of locating this in a social upheaval. Because for 3 years, from 1970 to 1973, there were, according to the FBI and the Treasury Department, there were something like 25 or 30,000 anti-government bombings, anti-police,
How many?
30,000.
Wow.
The Weather Underground took credit for 24.
So somebody else.
I'm trying to just locate it,
Right.
What I'm saying is that the resistance to police repression and the resistance to this war,
it wasn't
on campuses, off campuses, and what made us become notorious, I suppose, or prominent, is that we were well-known student leaders, and we liked to yak, we liked to talk, and so stuff just went on, just an ROTC building burned. But whenever we did anything, we had to yak about it, blah, blah, blah. So from our perspective, what we were doing was we were trying to educate people. We were trying to issue a screaming response to genocide, and we were trying to educate people about it. So for us, the communiques were very important. We issued it was 130 pages long, or saying politics, anti-racist politics mattered, and why we should all join the struggle. I think we were more propagandists than we were anything else. But frankly, that's the way struggles are. Even when you are involved in armed struggle, the struggle is mainly an attempt to communicate. And so we never thought for a minute that our little pea shooters could go up against U.S. imperialism and win. That wasn't the point. The point was to persuade lots and lots of people that we were on the right side and that they should join that side. The side against foreign wars, the side against invasions and occupations, the side against white supremacy. That was our message. So yeah, we did, and then prominently. Okay, I'll just tell you very, very quickly that we were, I suppose, best known for bombing the Pentagon, the Capitol, the New York State Office of Prisons after the Attica uprising, the California Office of State Prisons after the murder of George Jackson. So these were things that we were known for. But that wasn't our main work. That was a sometimes thing.
And we're talking about like social movements, people organizing, groups coming together with focused initiatives and agendas. And with some of the obstacles and barriers that you talked about in the past, they still are in our face today.
Absolutely.
And so there's still a need for social action, organization, and all those type of things. Do you think that our organizing and our groups now have what it takes to really push forward, considering things, media, the way that we use so much media ourselves, social media, and I guess with it being so good, sometimes it can be bad and overused. And then just with mass media and how it paints certain pictures, do you feel that we can have some of those same type of advancements or successes, if you want to put it
even
like
with
that?
those networks, like you were able to build those networks, those safe houses, etc. Is that type of organization, to piggyback off BG's question, is that even possible today?
I don't know. I'm much more interested in learning from you about what's going on than I am in telling anybody what to do. But I'll tell you this: there's a rhythm to activism, and I have my Twitter account, and I blog, and I like most people my age who are digital immigrants, I speak with a heavy accent, and if I ever get in trouble, I always ask a 10-year-old how to solve my problem, because old people don't get it naturally, You know what I'm saying? Or?
But I guess it's more or less, not from a technology perspective, but more or less from the collective unification that you all had. The bond that you all had, the Weather Underground, and even I believe I read or heard an interview, you were familiar with the Panther 21, and even being able to work with those groups.
Sure.
There was a different type of bond back during that time. Do you have that? Do you sense that same type of unity today in the universe?
In a way, I do, and I don't want to get lost.
Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
It does. It does. And I just. Two quick things before I tell you what I really think we need to do. One is I want to remind you that I do not glorify the 60s. So when you say you had this, you had that, be a little suspicious about that. We didn't have that together. Kids today are smarter than we ever were. They're more aware of the world than we were. Gotcha. I mean, we were idiots in a lot of ways, just like everybody. And whatever we were doing, it was we saw a quarter of inch of reality. We didn't see all of it. And I worry that we get glorified, or in two ways. One is some people say, the 60s, I was born in the wrong decade. That's nonsense. Other people like John McCain think the 60s was the devil's own workshop. It wasn't that either. It was a mixture of mishmash of this and that. But I think there's a responsibility that we have when we're thinking of ourselves as building social movements. And it always follows the same rhythm. And I see it very hopefully today. Let me say, before I even say what that rhythm is, I'll tell you what makes me hopeful is that you can put a pillow over a man's head for just so long, and eventually he'll fight back. Mm-hmm. He will not be suffocated without fighting back. And that pillow is being put over a lot of our heads. And I see people pushing back. And the Black Lives Matter thing is part of that. The Arab Spring, very exciting. Occupy was exciting to me. Was it everything? No. Was it? I get irritated with old people who are impatient with things like Occupy. Like what? You thought they were going to pitch tents in Wall Street? No, that was never on the agenda. That wasn't what they were doing. But did they look at? I'm going to take Occupy for 1 second. They changed the conversation in this country.
Right, understood.
Nobody ever said the 99% before Occupy. These tax income inequality. That was Occupy. Now it's mainstream. We're all talking about it. Of course, they're trying to co-opt it, but here's how they respond, how power responds to Occupy, to Black Lives Matter, to any social movement, feminism, anything. They always respond the same way. They ignore it, they ridicule it, they beat the crap out of it, and or they try to co-opt it, then they beat the crap out of it, and then they start over. Try to ignore it, try to ridicule it, try to co-opt it, then beat it up, and then and then you got to start over. So I think the response of power to Black Lives Matter, we should never contribute to either ignoring it or ridiculing it or calling it out for its shortcomings or trying to co-opt it. It's a very exciting movement from below. That's what changes the world. Here's what I think we all have to do. There's a rhythm to activism, and there's a rhythm to being a good citizen. There's a rhythm to being a moral person, and it always starts with opening your eyes. You cannot act morally or responsibly with your eyes firmly closed. You have to try to see the world as it is. I remember when my mother I was taking care of my mom 30 years ago. She'd broken her ankle, and she said to me one day, it was around the time of it was around the time when climate change was first being discussed, before you all were born. And my mom says to me, "What's this thing I hear about global warming?" And I say to her, I give her a real short response. I don't want to scare the shit out of the old lady, so I give her a real calm response. And she looks at me kind of angrily, and she says, "Well, I'm sorry I asked. I'm sorry I asked." Of course, because when you asked, I told you. And when I told you, you feel compelled to do something. And in your little privileged little suburban heaven, you got a swimming pool. You got, the lawn is watered by illegal immigrants. In other words, why should you worry?
Right.
My point is, you got to open your eyes. You cannot be blind and be moral or activist. Second thing you got to do is be astonished. And this is sometimes harder. You have to be astonished at both the beauty and the ecstasy and the greatness of things like kids coming together in Black Lives Matter. You got to be astonished at that. You also have to, and you got to be astonished at the corruption and rottenness of the system. And if you get jaded, you won't be astonished. Oh, well, that's the way they are. They steal. No, you should be pissed off every time they steal from us. Every time. So we shouldn't just say, "Oh, Volkswagen's polluting the world. Oh, go home. That's business as usual." No, it's not. We're angry about it. And the fact that others are doing it, we're angry about that too. So you got to kind of be astonished. You got to be angry a little bit. And then you have to act. You have to do something. And my students say, when I hear you talk, I feel like I have to do everything. And my response is always, you don't have to do everything. In a world as out of balance as this, do anything. Anything you do. And then connect it to somebody else's anything. And then we're rolling. So you open your eyes, you're astonished, you act, and this is where the Weather Underground went off the tracks. You then doubt. You have to question yourself. Was it right? Did I do a good job? Could I have done better? Is there another way to look at it? If you don't doubt, you become dogmatic. If you become dogmatic, you don't think, and dogma is the enemy of thought. So that's my rhythm for how I think about it, and I think that if you do that every day, if you repeat for a lifetime, opening my eyes again and again and again, not once, and getting it right, and then automatic pilot. Every day it's changing. You're learning more, you're reading more, you're studying more, and then you act, and then you doubt.
When you talk about opening your eyes, you're saying that individual needs to open their eyes, right? Because I can't make person X open their eyes to see the relevance in this particular issue or what have you.
Yeah, you can and you can't. You can and you can't. You can't in the sense that you can't make them, but you can in the sense that one of the things about my early activism, you were asking about my family and stuff, I got to say, I influenced my aunts and uncles and cousins because they watched me and they said, "What the hell is Bill doing?" And I think that what you do is a kind of education, and you have to be willing to talk to people, to dialogue with people. And dialogue is a great, great kind of medium for education, because dialogue assumes that I'm going to speak with the possibility of you're hearing me, but I'm going to listen with the possibility of you changing me, even subtly. And I think that's what it means to be alive. So you have to kind of think, and a good test of this is, have you learned an important lesson in the last year? Could you articulate that lesson? We should be learning important lessons every day. We should be reading things that change us, or who challenge us, right? So I assume you guys have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. I gotta say, I learned something from reading. I learned a lot from reading that book. He's a young guy, you know. Oh yeah,
he just got did you hear? He just won the award, the MacArthur Award.
That was some week for him. He was on the cover of Harper's the Atlantic. He had a cover story in the New York Times. He was on #1 bestseller of the New York Times, and he won a MacArthur Genius Grant. Well, hell, you know.
And we're trying to get him on the FREELUNCH podcast.
You should tell him your Genius Grant is pending. Tell him that. Yours is coming up.
Whatever works.
Stanley Nelson got a Genius Grant too several years ago. Yeah.
So I know we're approaching our hour, so I do want to kind of move this a little bit further ahead, and I wanted to get to something that BG opened up with earlier. You kind of, and maybe this isn't true. You tell me otherwise. But I'll use the word, you faded to black until 2008. After the Weather Underground kind of went its course, then you kind of faded to black, so to speak. And you could correct me if I'm wrong, but figuratively
it's a good metaphor. Yeah.
But in 2008, your name became it was spoken a lot during the Democratic primaries. Can you kind of talk about that incident, what it did for you? But also, I do want to start off with the question: did you have a relationship with President Obama?
Yeah, you know, I'll tell you that we lived in the same neighborhood. We were on.
Oh, right.
He lives 2 blocks from me.
Is that the neighborhood where the Honorable Louis Farrakhan house is?
Yeah, I live. My house is 2 blocks from Farrakhan's house. Oh, yeah. 2 blocks from Obama's house. 3 blocks from Jesse Jackson. 4 blocks from Gwendolyn.
Hyde Park,
Chicago.
Chicago. I've been over there.
I always used to say to Bernadine, I live in the safest house in the country because I got the Fruit of Islam guarding the north side. I got the green zone over here. I got the Chicago surveillance over there. And she always says to me, if you get mugged, nobody's going to give a shit. You know, they're all going to laugh. But yes, here's what happened in 2008. I'll tell you quickly, and then I'll tell you my relationship with the president. But I had my students. I'm a professor. I was a professor. I still am, but retired. So I had my doctoral students over to the house for potluck, which I often do. Mm-hmm. So I had 15 students in the living room. It was April of 2008. And there was one of the debates going on. It was between Clinton and Obama. Mm-hmm. And George Stephanopoulos was making a mess of things. And we had our seminar. And somebody turned on the TV as the seminar ended. And it was right at the point when George Stephanopoulos says to Obama, what about your relationship with this fiery preacher, Jeremiah Wright? Mm-hmm. And he, what about that? And Obama tries to explain it. And he says, and what about this other character, he says, Bill Ayers, he claims to bomb the Pentagon, and you have a relationship with him, and he's never apologized. What's that like? And Obama said, he's a guy around the neighborhood. He's an English professor, something like that. He said he's an English professor, which isn't what I am, but that's okay.
You're not English.
So my students literally fell on the ground. I mean, some of them literally and one student turned to me and said, my God, that guy's got the same name as you. Somebody else explained to her, it's because we were the same guy. And I was the guy around the neighborhood. It was quite surreal. And suddenly, broadcasting in our little living room all across the country and the world, I'm pulled into this as this shady character. But here's what was happening. And it's important to remember there was Hillary Clinton who did this. It wasn't Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin and John McCain picked up the narrative. Right. But the narrative that Clinton figured out was nobody could figure out how to run against this very charismatic, really smart, kind of winning young politician. How do you run against him? So Clinton's strategy was simple. She says, we don't know anything about him, but we know he's got some shady friends. Look, he's got a black nationalist preacher. He's got a terrorist. He's got a Palestinian scholar. He's got, a left-wing priest. And it's true. We all knew each other in Hyde Park. But as I said at the time and many times after, I knew Obama, we never saw each other, allied politically, but we knew each other as guys around the neighborhood. I saw him all the time. His kids and my kids saw each other. So it wasn't that strange. And what the attempt to make it into a big thing is typical of kind of American political chatter. Because the fact is that Obama knows lots of people, the fact that he talks to lots of people should not be a sin. Mm-hmm. It should be a virtue, right? But they tried to turn it into a sin. The reality is that Barack has always been what he said he was. I'm a middle of the road, mainstream, slightly progressive politician. The right wing looked at him and said, no, he's a secret Muslim, secret socialist, palling around with terrorists, black nationalists. And the left looked at him and said, I think he's winking at me. But he wasn't winking. He is a middle of the road politician. He had a record in Illinois. Remember me telling you about the death penalty? Mm-hmm. Governor Ryan was an abolitionist. Barack was still trying to find a compromise. So that's who he is. Is he a smart guy? Smartest guy I've ever met. Is he compassionate, lovely, decent person? Is he a good papa? He is. Mm-hmm. So all that's true. But he's also doesn't share my politics. And he wouldn't share my politics. You talk about educational reform. I'm 180 degrees away from the Obama administration on what I think should be happening in schools. So yes, we knew each other, we served on 2 boards together. But that's because we're both Chicagoans and we're both, involved in social issues.
But that's a good alley-oop for your perspective on education.
Yep.
Where it is now.
Well, I want to ask you a quick, specific question to that, and you can probably expound. Is Common Core the answer?
No, Common Core is not the answer. The real problem that we face in education nationally, in national educational policy, is that this issue has been framed by power to say that there are 2 kind of sides in the education debate. On one side is the corporate reformers. They call themselves the revolutionaries. They're the reformers, and they want charter schools and vouchers, kill the teachers' union, reduce education to a standardized test, to a single metric on a standardized test score. And then the way that power frames it is the other side, the liberals, are defending the teachers' union and defending the status quo. That dichotomy is wrong. Mm-hmm. It's not even close to true. What we really need in this country, and it's completely within our grasp, we need to reframe the debate, and we need to say, instead of saying these small things like we need more charters, we need to say education needs generous funding. We need what the most powerful people and the most privileged people have for their kids should be the standard by which we want to aspire for our kids. Mm-hmm. So, for example,
I agree.
So, for example, Mayor Daley, mm-hmm. Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama, Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, and me sent our kids to the University of Chicago Laboratory School. What did they get at the University of Chicago Laboratory School? Class size capped at 18, an organized teachers union which is respected and negotiated with. No reliance on test scores. They take a third of the tests at that school that they take in the Chicago public schools. Abundant art programs. And then the schools that Arnie Duncan and company are promoting don't have arts programs, don't have libraries, don't have a curriculum based in part on asking your own questions. They would never send their kids to the schools they advocate. They would never send their. So where does Barack Obama's kids go now? Sidwell Friends. Right. It's a lovely school. Mm-hmm. Why is that not the model for what we're building instead of? And so we talk about parent choice, but in Chicago, what parental choice means, an analogy. You want to choose between having an apartment with no heater or an apartment with no doors and windows. I mean, that's no choice at all. That's the choice they're giving kids in Chicago. You can go to DuSable High School, or you can go to this charter school, which has doubled down on all the reasons DuSable failed. So it's more drill and kill, more zero tolerance, more, and so instead of engaging the kids the way Barack Obama's kids are engaged or Arnie Duncan's kids are engaged, how can we listen to Arnie Duncan say, this is good for your kids? Oh, but for my little darlings, it's over here. Take one quick example. And incidentally, every time something happens in Chicago that I find reactionary in the schools, I always go to the lab school and ask what they do. Two simple examples. The Chicago Public Schools banned a graphic novel called Persepolis about the Iranian Revolution, one of my favorite comic books. They banned it. So I go over to lab school. I say, do you guys have Persepolis? The librarian tells me she has 9 copies, 2 in the original French. They have the movie. I say, do the kids read it? Yeah, the 7th graders are all required to read it. So the privileged kids get real art and real literature. The kids in the Chicago Public Schools get 1 more hour of drill and skill. That's the discrepancy that we should not allow. When they passed the law in Illinois that 30% of a teacher's evaluation in the Chicago Public Schools were based on test scores of their students, I went over to the lab school, had a meeting with the director and with the head of the union. We talked about how they evaluate teachers and how they develop teachers. We had a 2-hour conversation. I won't tell you the whole conversation, it's too long, except to say, at the end of it, I say to them, what part do standardized test scores play in teacher evaluation? And they looked at me like I was from Mars, and they said, what does standardized test scores have to do with good teaching? Exactly. Well put, and why do you let them get away with it? I mean, the privileged have no interest in fighting it, but to me, the gross hypocrisy of the man who's holding the whip hand on educational policy nationally, telling us what we should do for poor kids when he would never allow it for his own kids, ought to be something we expose.
I have a friend that works, and this is a topic for me, and I know we're running out of time, but this is a topic for me that's education is extremely important to me. I have a friend that works in the DC public school system, and they had a meeting, and I want to get and the reason I'm asking this is I want your how should this be handled, or what can we do? But they had a meeting, the teachers and administration basically had a meeting that said the administration told the teachers they have too many discipline write-ups. So saying that they had written up the students over 200 times, and that if they continue to write the students up, then then the administration is going to write the teachers up, basically trying to put the blame on the teachers and saying, hey, you need to be more disciplinary, rather than seeing the big issue is that of the entire landscape at the school and the administration is more of a top-down versus bottom-up issue. And so now the administration was trying to put the blame on the teachers versus saying, hey, we have a serious discipline problem at the school. Let's find a root cause and address it. What would you tell a struggling teacher, or how can a struggling teacher that deals with that type of problem where they're not getting help from the administration for the discipline problems, but then they're having to try to deal with more of discipline rather than being able to educate the students because of the time spent disciplining the students?
It's such a huge question. It goes in every direction, and I can't.
Have you heard that? Have you heard of that before?
Oh yeah, not only have I heard about it, but when you say Washington D.C., I immediately think of Michelle Rhee, who was the CEO, who was famous for closing schools and firing teachers and all this. She also cheated on the standardized tests. She also sends her kids to a private school. So these people get away with murder. It's kind of crazy, but. In this, the challenge for teachers at all times is to see the students for who they really are and to work together as a collective and not to rely on the administration to do the right thing. But I want to make a prediction. As soon as they call you in and say, we need to get the write-ups down, the write-ups will go down. Mm-hmm. And this is because, this is a little paradox I'm going to tell you, that has everything to do with school reform. A performance metric only works as a performance metric if it's not used as a performance metric. Let me explain.
Say that one more time.
A performance metric only works as a performance metric if it's not used as a performance metric.
Gotcha.
So you put. Here's what you do.
That makes sense.
So here's what you do.
That makes a lot of sense.
You say, the universe that I'm interested in is survival after surgery. That's the universe. But I give you a performance metric. Let's see who stays alive for 30 days after surgery. You go to Presbyterian Hospital. Everyone stays alive for 31 days.
Right.
Why? Because they can put them on machines and keep them going for 31 days, and then they pass. So the performance metric is not making it a better hospital. Right. Oh, so you say in Russia, you say traffic fatalities will be counted no longer as 5 days; they'll be counted as 10 days. Traffic fatalities just went down.
Right.
10 days after that. So the point is, and this is what we do in schools. We say this test score has everything to do with whether you're going to keep your job, with whether your school's going to get funded, with whether your state's going to get funded, whether Arnie Duncan's going to give you a grant like he's some petty foundation officer instead of the Secretary of Education for all the children. Okay, you get a good thing on it, and guess what's going to happen? Your test scores are going to go up. And guess what else is going to happen? You're going to cheat, you're going to lie, you're going to steal. It happened in Atlanta, it happened in D.C., it happened in the privileged community of Lake Forest, Illinois. You have incentivized cheating by making, and so here's a great example. There's a school in Chicago called Urban Prep. They want to say they're a good school. We're a good school, and what's the performance metric? 100% to college. They do two things. They push out the kids who aren't going to go to college, and then they call college anything you can think of, right? So they get 100% to college, but does that make it a good school? Not really. But they've conflated the universe with the performance metric. Don't ever get swindled by that kind of crap.
We got to have him back. And we got to have you back
Let's meet right here in this conference room.
No, we got to have you back just for education reform because we definitely need to, because I think we touched on a lot of things, and we really wanted to introduce this audience to who you were, and also to the role that you played in American history with the Weather Underground, etc. But there's a larger conversation that we even want to have, that I would like to have, and it's really around education reform.
I think that'd be great. I was just at Yale University debating the question of.
I saw that. It's on YouTube.
Is it? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh man, what a debate! And I literally a kid, well scrubbed little. It kind of kills me, these privileged kids. This kid, well scrubbed, he gets up and he says, "You're acting as if the point of education is social justice or social uplift. The point of education is to train the elite to run the rest of the country." Yeah, that's your view, but you go to Yale.
Exactly.
So that's what I'm saying. So let's do it. Let's
do it. So thank you, Bill, for joining us. I know you have some other endeavors, and we want to make sure we get you out there. But if you take us up on that offer, we do want to schedule a podcast in the near future or so to talk about education. But I want to bring actual teachers. Some kind of way, get some teachers. Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
Actually, if you guys want to come to Chicago, we could have a great time. You have to bring your girlfriend. You hear me, Vici?
Yeah, I got it.
And we'll go see the city. We'll get some teachers and have a conversation.
We need to do that. So we need to we'll figure that out and work it out. So how can the people, if they're interested in getting to know more about you, how can they reach you or learn more about you? And
I've written a ton of stuff. You can find me online. I'm on Facebook, but I have my email is BillAyers123@gmail. I tell everybody BillAyers123@gmail, and I'm pretty good on email. So it's great to be with you guys. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. And BG, anything else you want to summarize?
Well, before that, I just want to say, Bill, I read a lot of stuff about you. I watched a lot of YouTube videos. There's a lot of people that don't like you. They don't like you.
I think they've got a stereotype too. I honestly do. It's not that I think everybody should like me. Everybody doesn't like everybody, but I think that there's this cartoon character called Bill Ayers who it's fun to kind of poke at, but that's not me. And I'd be happy to. I've had so many conversations with so many right wingers in so many contexts. And we've
seen them. They're on YouTube.
I made it about an hour and 20-minute presentation just on you.
I love it.
Megan Kelly?
If it keeps them busy and off the streets, I'm for it.
And who knows, BG, what are they going to say after this podcast with us? Are we not tied to the...
I don't mind because...
You know what? It didn't hurt Obama. It won't hurt you.
Yeah, I don't think so. And hopefully, by you taking to the microphone, you had an opportunity to share with us your story. And I'm with you, Bill, in spite of what the people say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us so much.
Appreciate it.
As far as the podcast, you can find us, freelunchpodcast.com, podcasts and blogs, also on Twitter. Let us know what you think, Free Lunch Pod C. Also on Instagram, Free Lunch Podcast, and be sure to check for this video, YouTube, Free Lunch TV.
So thanks again to Bill, BG. Another long day, another working day, but a great podcast. I hope the Free Lunch family and the listeners really enjoyed this podcast. But I guess two takeaways for me. Number one, go read and purchase the book Fugitive Days. Go read about the Weather Underground. Very interesting. But also get involved on the educational front. And we did a conversation on education, Bill, and I was really high on PTAs. And whenever we get this forum back again, I do want to reintroduce that conversation and talk about having these different PTA, because I think PTA or PTOs are really important. And so I kind of just want for our listeners to get involved in the schools and really go back and listen to this conversation, specifically around the education piece and how we should expect the same level of education that the elite are getting, or that our so-called leadership is sending their students to. So we should demand those things. But I'm rambling now, so I just want to say thank you guys for tuning in and listening. We are the Free Lunch Podcast, home to the New South movement. This is your boy Tight, and I got my man BG with me, and we out of here. Peace.
Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Get it, got 'em. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Super mathematics, not a problem, no knock for that old block. So sign away for that bull rock. Super small, handcrafted art designs, no they know not. Flow tougher than tough time, blacker than the gram, they drum line. No overdose, I'm overwoke, I'll be awake for lunchtime. Yeah, everywhere like sunshine, I leave right close. Punchline, I beat the track, I eat the track, brown paper breakfast. Lunchtime, dinner date, dessert tray. Ramadan, flow hungry, you see the sign between the line, it's G's only. No dummies, I flow lovely, they go nutty, they catch feeling, these hoes touch. Yeah, I tell that jump off, no bunch, no awakening, home study. But you're so pretty, bless your soul. Sometimes the best way to touch him, stand and go. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Get it, got 'em. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Mathematics, before I chose the path chose me. This is the Lord's plan, divine decree.